Well, it's time to meet today's specialists. She is a psychology expert, a television and radio host, and a member of the Donald J. Trump for President Media Advisory Board, and she specializes in the psychology of politics. Dr. Gina Loudon is here. And he is a New York Times bestselling author, a human rights activist, and a jazz recording artist, and he specializes in music and politics. Mark Steyn is here. All right, Mark, North Korea has been saying this kind of stuff over and over and over again all the time, but they know Trump doesn't have to say anything. They know that if they came after us, his regime's over, playtime's over, party's over.
I'm not sure they do know that, actually. It's interesting to me the way they threaten Guam. There was a story about 20 years ago when the North Korean thing started. It was in all the Canadian papers about how the North Koreans had plans to nuke Montreal because it would show that they were serious, but unlike nuking Cleveland, wouldn't prompt an American response. And I don't know that in the crazy way they think in Pyongyang, they're not thinking, well, if we threaten Guam, which is a U.S. territory, it will show that we're serious without provoking the same kind of threat response as if we nuke Los Angeles. We're dealing in a world where the most isolated regime on Earth is a nuclear power. And that should never have been allowed to happen. And so when you see things, as Lisa was saying, the Washington Post headline, are we on the brink of nuclear war with North Korea?
Great minds think alike, Mark. I knew I liked you.
Well, but you know, what a headline. Are we on the brink of nuclear war with North Korea? Probably not. It's always probably not until you wake up, switch on the TV, and there's the mushroom cloud. You know, that's not really good enough, probably not.
So what do we do then, Gina? What do you think, like what President Trump is doing now? Does he need to do more? Does he need to do less? What are your thoughts?
When you're dealing with a dictator, and we don't even know, to your point, Mark, we don't even know that his generals are honest with him, right? We don't know if a general comes to him and says, you will lose, right? Because the guy has a God complex. Let's not forget that.
Oh, yeah.
So if they come to him and say, you will lose, does he shoot them? Like, what happens to the person who talks truth to him? Because everybody knows a dictator surrounds himself with yes men. So therefore, you have somebody who really may not be aware that he would actually lose in a nuclear conflict. He might think there's a way he could win. That's a very scary part. So yes, I like the way that the president has stepped up and confronted the bully on the playground, Kat. That's what this really is. This is bully on the playground mentality, and the president is responding appropriately.
And we know he feeds people to tigers. I mean, that's what he does.
But I think he knows he would. I think he does know he would lose. I think he definitely surrounds himself with yes men. But I think that one thing, I do think he knows that if he attacked us, it would be suicide.
But we're also gearing up to even more heightened tensions, right? Because in just a couple of weeks from now, we are gearing up to have military exercises with South Korea, and that aligns almost with the same timeline that North Korea is threatening Guam. So, you know, I think if we see this sort of rhetoric right now, if we think this is bad now, I mean, it's only going to heighten that much more so here in the coming weeks,
and it's
given
only,
those two circumstances.
Very true, and it's only heightened over the last 20 years. Mark, you know, the last time there was a credible threat of action against North Korea militarily was 1994 under Bill Clinton. Since then, we've tried sanctions, resolutions, talks, diplomacy, all the preferences of the international elite and the intelligentsia and the Council on Foreign Relations crowd. Right. You're a student of history. Has that ever worked, and can that work?
No, because broadly speaking, the Western world likes talking, and talking is the point. So they say, well, we need to get to a point where we're back in active talks with Iran. And for people like Iran and North Korea, the point of talking is to provide a cover for you to get on with your nuclear program, while at the same time sending your house-trained, bespoke diplomat to sit around the table with Europeans and North Americans, pretending to be... And you talk about history. That was the same way it was. I dislike Nazi comparisons, but when you look at the German diplomats in the early 1930s, they were respectable, civilized men, and they flew around all the chancelleries of the world, and people thought, well, these people seem like reasonable people, so why don't we just carry on talking and doing this and chit-chatting, and the world will come to rights. And it doesn't work like that.
No, it really doesn't.
Well, here's my issue, though. If people say, okay, we have to do something, we have to go in there, we have to get all this stuff, most experts agree we couldn't find everything, and that would guarantee that they would retaliate. So I think that that's where the idea comes from of let's not do that?
Well, it's a risk reward. I mean, there's some wars worth fighting to get to a just peace where you're not living under the specter of blackmail the entire time. So if you do play it forward 20 years, now might look like a pretty darn good time to do something about it. Just like 1994 looks like a great time to have taken a preemptive measure in North Korea when they didn't have nuclear capabilities.
Well, our Constitution also doesn't allow for that, though, without consulting Congress.
Well, after 60 days, you have to go to Congress and get authorization, but the executive has the authority to take an action to protect the United States.
Well, and I think the difficulty we're facing right now is, one, there are no really good options here because we know war on the Korean Peninsula could lead to catastrophic losses, as said and stated by the Secretary of Defense. And we don't really have a ton of leverage over North Korea as well. And so I think that's why we've seen this increased rhetoric from President Trump, because I think he recognizes the fact that we don't have the economic tools like China does with, controlling 90% of the trade with North Korea. We don't have a lot of tools at our disposal. So I think President Trump, what he sees is that we have to convince North Korea that we are willing to act if you mess with us. And so I think that's what we're seeing with sort of this heightened, increased rhetoric from the president, also, quite frankly, the Secretary of Defense in these past couple of days as well.
That's true. And, Doctor, on the campaign trail, there was a lot of talk from this president about China and bad trade deals. And if we want to talk about leverage, China's the one that probably has the most. Is now the time to put the screws to them and say, it's put up or shut up? We know you don't share our interests, but we can find a convergence if we really push.
I think we have to be strong with China because, again, that part of the world really only understands strength. We've seen it over and over again. If you don't come back as strong, then they're just going to push back even harder because it is, again, back to that bully on the playground mentality. But here's the thing about China, and this is what makes it so complicated and tricky. We don't even really know when they're being completely honest with us, if they're being completely honest with us or not. So it's not like normally when we can use what is really an ally. This is not that. Very and even when they say something to us, we have absolutely no way to know if it's true. So this is really an international crisis like we've really never seen. We can make comparisons, but there really aren't any for so many reasons.
China actually wants problems for us there. They want us out of the region.
Yeah, but they don't, of course, want an all-out war. All right, well, Guam, of course, is standing in the crosshairs of potential North Korean missile attack, and the U.S. territory's governor appears to be backing President Trump's hardline rhetoric against the rogue state.
But I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. I feel more confident that if someone is to make a threat to my people, the people of Guam, that my president will say, if Guam is attacked, then hell and fear will fall on the attacker.
I wish our leaders wore stuff like that, first of all. I do. I think we'd all get along better.
If President Trump is watching, we have a request.
I think that we'd all get along better if everyone was wearing fun vacation shirts.
That was my Friday specialist request.
Yeah, absolutely.
I got denied by
But clothing choices aside, that's interesting, Mark, because a lot of people take the point of view of, hey, this threat only happened after the hyped up rhetoric, but he doesn't seem to see it that way.
No, he doesn't see it that way, and it's very real for them. They're dealing with basically 1950s duck and cover exercises now. They're being told, don't look up if there's a big flash in the sky. That's only going to make things worse for you. And this is a very specific thing. This guy, who actually hasn't demonstrated he's capable of hitting a barn door, has said he's going to put 4 missiles north, south, east, west of the island, like some spectacular choreographed Disney aquacade thing, and we are supposed, and just to Pete's point about a credible military threat, the point isn't whether he acts on that. The point is we can't live in a world where people can get that specific about threats. The threat itself is a provocation, whether or not he acts on it.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, again, the comment or the threat came after President Trump's comment, though.
So the threats came when they started.
They've been going on forever and ever, but the more specific one,
on 4th of July, I think that sends a pretty strong message.
Of course it does. I don't think anyone's disputing that.
And we've seen an increase in these provocations, within recent times. So especially under Kim Jong-un. So I don't necessarily think there's a correlation with the rhetoric. I think we're going to see those increased provocations regardless, which is what we've been seeing. I think President Trump is just trying to make it exceptionally clear to North Korea, do not mess with the United States of America. I don't think he can get much clearer, but I think that is the point that the Trump administration is trying to ultimately make here.
Yeah, President Trump has great instincts. When he said fire and fury, and then the North Korea balked at it, he said maybe that wasn't tough enough, because they speak the language of toughness, and he's surrounded by advisors who are the definition of understanding what adversaries need to hear. I think this is far more, he's pushing toward brinksmanship, because only when you get to a point where someone believes you'll do something do you get a moment of diplomacy or a moment where you can walk them back. It requires a steel spine to do that. And how many steel spines are there in Washington, D.C.? Not a whole lot. Thankfully, there's one in the
Mostly made of Jell-O.
To President Trump's credit, Gina, China does seem to be taking this seriously, more seriously than they had been, at least.
Absolutely. We saw it with the UN vote. And I think the one thing that I found, just a little glimmer of hope today, was that there's so many retired military living in Guam, and many of these people have no fear at all because they understand our military capability. And those who understand it best, who live in Guam, who've worked in military forever, if they're not afraid, then it tells me that we really are prepared in ways that the average American may not be so aware of.